Welcome to Farlim House and Ipohworld's exhibition, A Tin Mining Family. Ipohworld is owned by Tenby School and is a project within the school. The exhibition features the history of this house and then the lifestyle of the family of Ipoh's Tauke's. Welcome to our world, Ipohworld, saving yesterday for tomorrow. Farlim House first started as a very simple house. It was the first house on the site. It was square and it had wooden elevations. It was built around 1902 by Fu Chu-chun. Fu Chu-chun was known as the richest Chinaman in the world. Not long after, another immigrant came in, Fu Net-zi. Fu Net-zi knew nothing about tin mining, but Fu Chu-chun taught him. He taught him so well that Fu Net-zi eventually became richer than Fu Chu-chun. Around 1926, Fu Chu-chun found himself short of money, and he owed a large debt to Fu Net-zi, something he had borrowed some years before. And so, to settle the debt, he gave his house and the 26 acres of land to Fu Net-zi. In 1927, Fu Chu-chun built a new house. Today, it is the Ipoh Museum, the Darul Rizan Museum. And in 1927 also, Fu Net-zi extended the house to the size it is today. And it looked exactly like this. It was a grand house. And outside, it had two beautiful Western African lions. That was very important because in China, you are not allowed to have Western lions outside your house unless you are of a very high status. So that indicates the status of Fu Net-zi, both here in Ipoh and in China. And this is the photograph taken just last year, before the development here started. As you pass this showcase, you will see there is a teapot, cups and tea warmer inside it. Many people wonder why I feature a teapot in a mining exhibition. The answer is very simple. In the old days, all the races suffered severely from cholera, but the Chinese suffered less than the others. Why? Because they boiled the water to make their tea. Looking at the history of these two gentlemen and taking Fu Chu-chun to start with, Fu Chu-chun really only had one major mine at Trono. But he was a very smart man. He employed somebody called John Addis from Cornwall in England, the heart of the world's tin mining industry. John and his son brought in the technology from UK and made Fu Chun a very rich man. That is why we call the Trono mine Fu Chu-chun's money box. There's one oddity about Fu Chu-chun. He was an opium addict, but at some stage he suddenly saw the light and he joined the Anti-Opium Society, and there he is in the committee. Turning to Fu Net-zi, he owned lots of mines, and this picture is one of his most famous mines. It was down in Tanjong Tuolang, and during the communist problems from 48 to 60, it was always suffering from attacks by the bandits. Nonetheless, they were often beaten off by the police, and here we can see the police in action guarding the miners. There's one very special thing about Fu Netzi, and that's, believe it or not, his funeral. It was said to be at least a mile long, and you can see how wide it was. In his will, he did something very unusual. He made a note that said that anyone from Ipoh could come to eat at Farlim House for the 31 days after his death. Here we look at the house, Farlim House, as a home, what it was like when it was lived in. It was a fairly austere house with Chinese furniture and not a lot else. It didn't look very comfortable, although it did have an English grandfather clock and several knickknacks which were in alcoves around the house. It seems that the house only had one really comfortable room, and you can see there was a Western sofa, and on the sofa the grandson and granddaughter of Fu Netzi. The house also had a lot of decorative cupboards and mirrors. These cupboards, unfortunately, and mirrors are no longer in the house. The final event that took place here before the house was sold by the family was the filming for Astro about Sybil Kathigasu, the famous Eurasian heroine who helped the anti-Japanese army and got caught by the Japanese doing so. She was tortured by the Japanese, both mentally and physically, and eventually died in Scotland in 1946. As an introduction to the lifestyle of the Taukays, we feature some of the old-time pleasures that all the local people at one time or another would have used. Betel nut, tobacco, and of course, Chinese wine. The Taukays, of course, almost all started off as poor men, but they were wise and sensible and saved their money, and eventually became not only the coolie, but actually the boss of the mine. That meant they had mighty mansions. They dressed in classic clothes. And of course, they had several wives. This one, Leong Sin Nam, had 6 wives. And Leong Phi, who lived in Tambun Road, 4 wives and 3 concubines. His son, the poor man, only had 2 wives. This showcase demonstrates the buying power of the Taukays. Huntley and Palmer's biscuit tins shipped in to Ipoh in the very early days from UK. 1893, 1889 and 1892. Of course, where did the tin come from? It came from the Kinta Valley, most probably, shipped all the way to UK and then back here as biscuit tin. In the early 1900s, they didn't have to import things themselves from UK. They could buy from the shop Whiteaways. Whiteaways specialise in goods from UK. You could buy beautiful dresses from London, or top hats for the gentlemen, but most of all, toys for the children. And here are some of the toys, and the photographs show grandsons of the Taukays we looked at earlier, all with their toys. Here are more pedal toys from Mobo and Triumph. And in the showcase behind, a range of toys from both before and after the war. Nearly all of them come from UK. Meccano and the Hornby train set. These are typical of the period that we're talking about. The Chinese, of course, love gambling, and horse racing was one of their favourites. Many of them had their own racehorses, and the Perak Turf Club here in Ipoh was the one place where the Chinese and the British could mix together, for all the other clubs were destined to be whites only. This showcase shows the sort of lighting that was used before electricity came to Ipoh. That was in the 1930s. The earliest houses was actually in that year. Before that, people had to light their homes with other appliances. The candle and kerosene lamps. And this particular one is a very nice piece, as it was a giveaway by Esso. In England, we call it the Wee Willie Winky lamp. You can carry it up the stairs to bed and then hang it on the wall. Of course, all the Taukays and the white people had servants, very often many of them. Most of them came from China and were called the black and the white Ama. Ama means little mother, for it was they that looked after the babies. But not only that, they worked in the kitchens, did the cooking, and often did gardening and all the other menial tasks. They were sworn to a life of celibacy and sent all their money back to their families in China. But not all the maids were from China. There were Indian maids and of course Malay maids. But in the main, most people had Chinese, and this is the maids from one family. The table below shows some of the things that would have been used in the kitchen. Many of these are still in use today, but there are a few things here which most people have never seen before. There are some very fine coconut scrapers, this one made by a Malay gentleman. The knife polisher, because we didn't want to have unpolished knives on the table in the old days, and the water filter, which comes from about 1900. It was the maid's job to draw water from the well and put it through the filter so that the family could have clean water. The Taukays, of course, didn't only spend their money on themselves. They were philanthropists. They spent the money on the people. First of all, they founded the Chinese schools, Yuk Choi, Hoi Lam, Shenjai, and others. They also put money into the missionary schools, ACS and St. Michael's. Speaking of ACS, most of the Fu family children went to ACS. It was a very, very good school. And here we have the first painting ever done by one of the Fu family when they were in Standard 1. When he was here the other day with his walking stick, he said he would never see that again. The other thing he did with his brother was the mock-up of the circus. The circus came to Ipoh every year, and he showed this for the ACS Open Day. The second thing that the Taukays spent their money on for the people were the clan associations, the Hakka and the Hokkien, the Chen clan. Each one of the clans from China had their own association. They were there for the clans to get together, but more importantly, for the immigrants coming in to have somewhere to go when they arrived in Ipoh. One old man told us that when he arrived here in 1932, he was wearing a singlet and long pants and no shoes. He said it didn't matter not having any shoes because nobody apart from government officers and Taukays wore shoes. He went to the Hakka Association and they gave him his money for his lunch. He went to a coffee shop and bought his lunch. A plate of yam cake, a plate of noodles and a pot of tea. How much was that lunch? 1 cent. The third thing that the Taukays spent their money on for the people was health. It all started with this gentleman who was called the Protector of Chinese. He had an impossible job. He was responsible for the health and welfare of all the Chinese coolies in Perak State. He was very concerned about the health and he wanted a hospital. And so he went to the government doctor, Dr. Conley, and he asked him for money for a hospital. Of course, the British government didn't have any money. And so they went to the two richest men in town, Leon Phi and Fu Chu Chun. And they gave them the money for the first hospital in Chamberlain Road. The land was donated by Chia Cheng Lim. And so the Chinese had a maternity hospital so their babies could be born in some semblance of hygiene. But soon the hospital wasn't big enough. And so the government went back to the Chinese and asked for more money, this time from these four gentlemen. Fu Net Zi, the builder of this house, had already departed this life, but he left a trust fund for just such a purpose. His trust fund bought the land, and the other three paid for the building. But there was a problem. In 1941, the Japanese invaded and took the hospital away from the Chinese and made it an Air Force headquarters. Then the British came back in 1945 and they did the same thing. They took it back and made it a military headquarters. So it wasn't until 1948 that the Chinese got their hospital back. Being entirely Chinese, it was run by the Chinese, and each of the Tauke's families took it in turn to run as presidents of the committee. Today, although the hospital has been taken over and run by the government, it still has a committee, a management committee, and today, even now, there is a Chinese Tauke at the head of that committee. He is the second son of this gentleman, and although he is not on this board, I didn't put him there deliberately because he is still alive. So far we've talked about the Taukes, but what about the poor coolies? There were thousands of them here, and they suffered, unlike their bosses. They suffered from what we call the four evils: opium, gambling, prostitution, and the triads. Turning to opium, here we have four pictures of opium dens. But opium 100 years ago was just the same as Panadol is today. It was a simple painkiller. Taken in small quantities, it does you no harm. But if you take it completely incessantly, then it kills you. And you can see here, this man is well on the way. It was very easy smoking opium. You needed a pillow and a pipe and a small lamp and a few small tools. It was really a very simple operation. You put the opium into the hole in the pipe and held it over the lamp. The heat caused the opium to smolder, and that is what you breathed in. It is said to give you a feeling of ecstasy. It takes the tiredness from the limbs. But when you wake up, things feel quite different. Considering gambling, there is no race in the world who are better gamblers than the Chinese. And no matter how little money they had, they would always continue to gamble. The game they played was Fantan, shown here. It's a simple game for 4 players and a banker. Here we have a Fantan board with angsana seeds as the medium for gambling. But actually, you can draw that board with a piece of chalk from the school classroom, or you can sketch it in the sand. It's a game that can be played anywhere. It's very simple, but the only real winner is the banker, who takes 30% of the pot every time. But what about prostitution? Well, there were no women in the mines, apart from the Julang washers, who went home at night. But there were plenty of women in town, and they were Japanese prostitutes. They came here because the economy in their country was very bad. Here we have Okiku. She lived in Belfield Street, eventually married a local, And when he lost his business and left Ipoh, she went back to her home country near Hiroshima. Here also we have 50 prostitutes at the Japanese cemetery in Buntong, Ipoh. It was 1921 and they were there to honor their ancestors. In those days, as you've already heard, a meal was very cheap, like 1 cent. So how much did a prostitute cost? Well, according to the book, enough to eat will do. Finally, the secret societies, the triads, and they were probably the worst of all for the poor coolie. For you had to join and you had to fight for them when they told you. The most famous fight was that took place up near Taiping, known as the Larut Wars. These were so bad, the Sultan Perak lost control of his state, and so he called upon the British to come in and help. And that was the beginning of the British rule in Perak. Now we turn to tin mining. Of course, if you wanted to mine tin, you had to find it first. And it was either below the ground or in the mountains. And the way to find it below the ground was to carry all this equipment into the rainforest and drill down to find what was there. Drilling was done manually, with 4 men standing on a wooden platform and pushing down, and 4 other men turning that platform. That way they could drill down to at least 100 feet. It was tough work, very, very hard, and pulling out the drill afterwards to find what was there was the most difficult. For this work, in the 1950s, they got paid $2 a day, but no pay if it was raining. Of course, if tin was found and a mine was opened, we had to cut down the rainforest. Here you can see a man cutting down a tree with simply an axe. And here they're sawing that tree up with a saw, something like this one down here, 9 feet long. Of course, mining for tin has a terrible effect on the environment. Back in the office in Ipoh or KL, the boss would want to know, what did the prospectors find? And so he would be presented with their findings in the form of bamboo tubes. Each tube would represent 1 drilling at all the different levels that they had found tin. With each tube there would be packets of tin, which shows how much tin they found at each depth. Thus, he knows where the tin is and what sort of percentage there is. These drillings were done every 20 meters, as the small red marks show. And so, if he could find there was a lot of tin in one area, then he would definitely decide to mine. If the boss did decide to mine, then it was really very simple in the early days. All he had to do was employ a lot of coolies and give them 2 simple tools, the chancor and the bucket. With the chancor they would dig into the clay, fill the bucket and carry it off to the tin shop, where the clay and tin would be separated from each other. Of course, the early mining was very labor intensive, and it wouldn't be unusual to have 20,000 coolies in one mine. But very soon, the idea of the monitor came. The monitor is nothing more or less than a big water hose. But the secret is, where does the water come from? The answer being from a pipeline which runs from the top of the hills. Therefore, the gravity between the top of the hill and the mine in the valley gives you magnificent pressure, enough to wash the clay out of the walls of the mine and to the floor. The amount of pressure was huge, And that can be seen from this photograph here, where the one pipeline is feeding many, many monitors. This is far different from the days of the coolie and his chancor. Much more efficient, and much more tin could be gained that way. Once the slurry from the monitor washing has reached the ground of the mine, it is pumped up by a very unusual pump, which is capable of pumping pebbles and stones. Known as the gravel pump, it would pump it to the top of a structure known as the pallon, again here, and the pallon sloped gently downwards, allowing the slurry to be washed down, and on the way down the heavier tin would be left behind. But not all the tin was collected on the pallon, and therefore the mines employed ladies, known as dulang washers, who would pan for the tin with a slice of wood called the dulang. Here we can see in the photographs Rawa women from Sumatra panning for tin, and here there are the Chinese. This was for all races, women only, and for each woman they had to have a license, $1 per year. But there was another method called the dredge, the bucket dredge, which was nothing more or less than a tin factory floating on a pool. At the front it had a chain of buckets, and this is one of them here. These would rotate through the dredge and bring with them mud, clay and stones from the bottom of the pool. This would then be processed by the dredge, taking away all the work that the previous people had to do. And the net result was that raw tin would find its way to rubber buckets on the dredge. And here are the buckets. They were invented here in Ipoh by the Kinta Rubber Works. The reason being, the wooden buckets were heavy and they rotted, and therefore they were generally unsatisfactory. Rubber buckets became a worldwide thing, all from Ipoh town. Here we have a mock-up of a dulang washer. We say she is on her way to the tin shop in Ipoh to sell her tin. The tin itself looks very unattractive. There it is, but that's what all the fuss is about. That is raw tin ore. She was very, very important to the welfare of the family here in Perak, because when the tin price was down, there was no work for the men. And she was the one that kept the food on the table to feed the family. No matter whether the tin ore came from the coolies, or the monitor, or the dredge, or the dulang washer, it had to be transported into Ipoh, to the tin shop, for further cleaning before being sent away to be smelted. In the early days, it would be a bullock cart carrying the tin, but he was just not strong enough, and so soon they developed the idea of using elephants. Of course, in the 50s, we turned to lorries. In the tin shop, the raw tin was washed again and then sewn into bags. Each bag weighed 100 pounds. Here are typical bags ready to go to the smelter. It was then shipped to the smelter, which was in Singapore, and there were 2 in Penang. At the smelter, it was melted down in nothing more or less than a very large furnace. And the net product of that melting down was a tin ingot. Here's one here. Again, it weighs 100 pounds. And so to conclude, the entire story is it all started here in the mountains, or down here in the ground. It ended up at the smelter as a £100 ingot. When it was shipped overseas to UK or America and turned into a product. Here we have one product, a British-made alloy, which was used for the bearings of car engines. When I was a boy, even your toothpaste tube was made of raw tin. And what's more, inside the toothpaste there was actually small elements of tin to help you brush your teeth. Now we turn to transport. And of course in the early days there were no motor vehicles here. And so rich people, the Sultan and the government officers rode on elephants. Goods were transported either by bullock cart or elephant, and people would ride either in the rickshaw, originally imported from Japan, or the gharry, an Indian idea, a rattling carriage pulled by a Sumatran pony. The Taukays preferred the horse and carriage, but some of the British preferred the dog cart. When the Japanese invaded in 1941, they discouraged us from using the rickshaw that they had actually invented and wanted us to use the trishaw because it was better for the man. Here we have a picture of the trishaws in a charity parade. The parade was to raise funds for the Tar College. The trishaws in the photograph were made by the same man that made this one, and he made the rickshaw you saw earlier. In fact, that was his lifetime's role, making trishaws and rickshaws. He's still alive in Ipoh today, but now of course he's a very elderly gentleman. We've already spoken about Japanese prostitutes, but there were lots of other Japanese here in Ipoh. The first one came in 1893, and here we have the Japanese Dobi in Club Road, close to the Ipoh Club. There were also Japanese barbers and 6 Japanese hotels. Women and Japanese monks living in Tambun, and the most important of all, the photographers. There were lots of photographers here, and so by 1941 the Japanese army had all the maps and photographs of their way from Kota Bharu all the way to take over Singapore. The postman, of course, wasn't Japanese, but here he is shown with his cart, and you will notice that he had a cap and a jacket and knee breeches, but no shoes. But remember, people didn't wear shoes in Ipoh. Eventually, the first motor car did arrive in Ipoh in the early 1900s, driven by Yu Tong Sen. Soon after that, Cycle and Carriage Company came to Ipoh with the imported Mercedes. And Mercedes soon became the car to have. Here is one in Belfield Street in Ipoh. But there were many other sorts of cars here. And here we have the classically dressed couple in their Wolseley from Britain in 1910. They would drive round the town every afternoon, and the local people would wave to them because they were dignitaries. There were plenty of other cars in Ipoh, both before and after the war. And this particular family had several. So here the family of Lau Ek Ching. Lau Ek Ching came here as a poor immigrant, but he became rich. A lawyer, a miner, a developer. And he had lots of children. And the children all had amas and drivers. And they had a wonderful life. Sadly, when they had gone, the only one left was a granddaughter in the big castle. She had no money left because they had spent it all. And so she had to demolish the house and sell the land and she became a piano teacher in Ipoh. So that proves the story. Money doesn't last in a Chinese family more than 3 generations. But not only the postman called at houses, but so did the hawkers. This particular hawker was photographed here at Farlim House. He was selling laksa and quail, and he would call here every day. He would have to stand at the gate and shout out, "Laksa, laksa," so that the maids or the security could let him in. This below is the sort of thing that he would have been carrying as he walked along the Lahat Road. He would have had noodles, the soup, and of course the quail in this basket. There were many hawkers around the town who were on bicycles, and the one that would call here the Farlim House was the Indian milkman. Of course, there were no milk bottles in those days, and so he had this rather special can, dated 1873. He could take off the lid and turn it upside down, and it became a funnel to pour the milk into the jug from the kitchen, or maybe an old bottle. The other very important man was the roti man on his bicycle. He would ring his bell as he came along, and the mothers would hear. Then mother would have given them a cent or two extra to buy the coconut sweets, or maybe the kaya sandwich. Much later, in the 1950s and 60s, the Coca-Cola hawker would also call. This particular machine was bought here in Farlim, just across the road from the house. We believe that he would pedal all the way from Ipoh to Menglembu and back on a daily basis. And as he passed F&N, who in those days marketed Coca-Cola, he would collect new stocks for his icebox and crates. F&N, of course, have been here in Ipoh for 100 years. And at one time, they actually advertised their drinks on the top of one of the few 3-story buildings in town. Like the Coca-Cola tricycle, Coca-Cola was also sold on the bicycle. And that, of course, was just one of the many things that were sold on bicycles. In the old days, you could buy everything from the man on his push bike. They sold ice cream, they sold cigarettes, soft drinks, almost anything you could think of. Even the Titbit man worked from his bicycle. We also feature some of the cinemas in Ipoh, because 4 of them were owned by Tauques. The Star and the Odeon, originally called the Rex, were owned by this family, the Fu family. Lau Ek Ching owned the Ruby, named after his daughter, and Dato Lok owned the Cathay. The theatres have got one thing in common. They were all designed and built by a gentleman from Copenhagen, Berthel Michael Iversen. He also built many other of the cinemas in Ipoh. Times were of course different in the cinema in the old days. The lights never went up, and so once you got your ticket, you had to find your way to your seat. And that is what these young ladies used to do. They were called usherettes, and with a special torch, with a red outside and a white spotlight in the centre, they would show you to your seat. Once you left the cinema to go to the hawkers outside, remember there was no popcorn stall inside, then you had to have pass-outs, which were chopped on the back so you could get back into the cinema again. Life was so different, and there were so many cinemas in Ipoh that competition was huge. In order to encourage you to go to their cinema, each one would put a flyer through your door every week. These are ones from the Chinese cinemas. Imagine 12 of these through your door every week. Cinemas were very, very popular during the 50s, 60s and 70s. But there were some people who couldn't get to the cinema. Pity the poor Tamil coolie, maybe 30 kilometers stuck out in the plantation. So many of the cinemas brought 16mm movies to those plantations, and they showed them on a white screen for a nominal amount. And to conclude the story, here we have one such 16mm film projector, which is actually loaded with the film Tin from Malayan Jungles that we show to the public when they are here. So that brings us to the close. Thank you very much for spending the time with us today to view our exhibition. We hope you enjoy it, and we hope to see you again.